Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Claire Schatz-Schneider. I'm a partner here at Deloitte, and on behalf of Deloitte, it's a pleasure to welcome you all for what promises to be a very timely conversation on resilience, sovereign industrial capability, and the technologies shaping the future of national security. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Over the past decade, the strategic environment has shifted in ways that are really forcing us to rethink some long-held assumptions. Supply chains that were all focused almost exclusively on efficiency are now being re-examined through the lens of resilience. Critical technologies are increasingly seen not only as drivers of economic growth, but as strategic assets. And the ability for nations to mobilise industrial capacity quickly in times of crisis has once again become a central policy topic. Ultimately, resilience in this context is defined as the capacity to absorb external shocks whilst maintaining the functioning of critical industries, markets and supply chains. True resilience is characterised by a shared understanding that strategic capability increasingly sits at the intersect of technology, industry and security. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the discussion today.
Hello, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jim Hayden. I'm the CEO at BluGlass. First, I'd like to thank you all for being here, and I'd like to extend thanks to Claire, Avi, and the entire Deloitte team, and then to Omer and General John Wharton for joining us this evening. I've been with these gentlemen all day, and they have a lot of great stuff to say. So I'm just happy that I can say a quick introduction, and I get to sit down and listen with you guys to these brilliant men. But I do want to tell you a little bit about BluGlass and why we would be involved in an event like this. So an important thing to step back is I think we have to understand what the importance of lasers are to the world today. And it could be overstated, but lasers are everywhere. We wouldn't be able to have the fiber optics if we couldn't put lasers underwater. Those fiber optics drive things like communications, so we could do Zoom meetings, so we could watch Netflix. There's a bunch of things that we have to have. Lasers are in space. They're in the medical offices and hospitals. Lasers are in the checkout stands. Lasers are used to disinfect viruses and bacteria in hospitals all around the world. And there's some major trends that are happening in the traditional infrared market right now. The AI needs data centers. That AI is driving a need for more and more LEDs, more and more lasers, more of the types of things that we do. If you look at the world news with the war, and you can see how lasers are being deployed to defend our freedom. And you could look at those trends with, as Claire said, the supply chain, right? We learned during COVID that if there's too much concentration of the supply chain in one part of the world, it's a risk for the US and our allies, such as Australia. And so we have to make sure that we have access to these critical technologies. So the final thing then in that all of those impetus, those are driving the need for lasers. The onshoring is a biggie. Getting the technology into sovereign countries and to being resilient, right, on our own. So we can stand as allies and friends when we need to. And the beautiful thing about it is when we invest through government activities, they're usually dual use applications, and those go into the commercial, and then they go into the defense and aerospace. And so that traditional market with all those factors is growing right now. And you can look in the market, it's forecasted to grow at a CAGR, which is much larger. It's typically a 4 to 5, it's a 6 to 8. And the areas where BluGlass is focused on, in aerospace defense, in biotech, biomed, and then in the quantum sensing, quantum computing, those are projected to grow in the next 5 years at 2 to 4 times that CAGR. And so with that excitement, we've been able to make inroads with the government and bring in people to the company like Omer. That's a heart of his strategy. A center of it is to help get sovereign nations to have it. And then the general has extensive experience. It's been my pleasure to be able to hear all the experience. So I want to stop talking and give you guys that pleasure. So if you could join me in welcoming.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Just want to make sure you can hear us okay? Yeah, great. Okay, excellent. I think we've had a great introduction. The world we live in today is definitely a different world to what we lived in 5 years ago or 10 years ago. The traditional paradigms of stability are being challenged, and therefore thinking about resilience is a very critical topic for nations, organisations, and all of us as individuals. To join us to talk about this topic today, and this is the only time I'm going to read, I promise, I'd like to introduce you first to Major General John Wharton. Over a 3-decade career in the United States Army, General Wharton culminated his service commanding the Army's Research, Development and Engineering Command. In that role, he oversaw 75% of the Army's R&D budget and oversaw almost 14,000 scientists and engineers. He has commanded global sustainment forces in active theatres, and today he advises governments and industry on accelerating defence innovation. General, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Joining him is Omar. Omar is a highly experienced entrepreneur, investor and corporate lawyer. He's based out of New York, as I've learnt today, brings a deep practical expertise across capital markets, advanced manufacturing and defence. Crucially for many in the room tonight, Omar has a proven track record of guiding companies through cross-border growth and getting them engaged directly with leading global defence primes. So Omar, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thank you.
What we have realised as we were prepping for this session is that there were beers outside and we were only served coffees and water in here. So let me start with that, right? I think this would have been a much better conversation after a couple of beers, but anyway, let's get into it. General Wharton, it would be remiss of me not to start noting what's going on around the world, asking you about the global and geopolitical environment that we're in today. We're seeing a highly complex and volatile environment around the world. Where are you seeing the geopolitical environment heading? Where's the world heading? That could be the whole conversation, I think.
No, well, thanks first of all for having me, and I appreciate Deloitte. We've had a long history of Deloitte when I was in the military and out. Let me just set a couple contexts before I answer the question here. So I commended the research and development, all the scientists and engineers, but also the sustainment portion. So I had a career in all the industrial base of the U.S. Army and the Joint Forces as we're posturing around the world of bringing industrial capabilities forward on the battlefield and in the real world. So, and as I have talked in the world, I would always tell everyone that as much as the industrial base and building industrial base capabilities, you have to build the technological base. So I've been very fortunate by the Army to give me a background that's unique. Here I was in global logistics, commanding global logistics commands, posturing around the world, and then, having global logistics or technology. So that combination is a little bit different because now I can talk technology or logistics, global supply chains. And it's not just one component of a global supply chain, it's from A to Z, the business of the Army, the business of government, which is different than if I were infantry and things of that nature. So it's how the Army runs, how the Department of Defense runs, the Department of War runs, and what are all the processes and procedures along that way. Now to get back to the question, it's a tough question, right? Because I spend, just so you know, we say national security, I interface with the whole of our government. So I talk at the highest levels across all departments and all agencies, and certainly the Department of War, Energy, and many others, Commerce, Treasury, and then on and on. And what I do is I do things in support of our government, and I use those words very important because it's important that I give you the context. In support doesn't mean assigned. And that's specifically, I was asked to take positions in this administration at a very high level in the industrial base, and I said I can do more for you by what I do now. And that's to engage with different countries. So I talk across the whole of the US government, and I try staying consistent because I can do things that you can't do if you're in the government, right? I'm not as restricted when I come and talk to leaders. So what I try to do is I try to bridge our government policies, try to stay consistent But I can go places, normally our government leadership will say, go talk to the president, prime minister, tribal leader, and go solve a problem. It may be an economic to an African country, it's a third world, it's food, shelter, clothing, energy. To a first world country, it may be, General Wharton, can you bring me the latest counter UAS? Can you bring me the latest EMP, cyber protection? So that range of things. Now, getting back to the world situation here. So I'm bouncing back between country to country. And we worked Panama, and just got the result we wanted in Panama. That was a 2-year project. But the world we live in today is not the world we knew before. It's being disrupted. And of what's going on. So you know what's happening in the war. Right, and there's some different dynamics there. There's different dynamics in Venezuela. There's different dynamics in Iran right now. And everyone is asking me, well, what's happening in Iran? What are we doing in Iran? And what's going to be the end state? And I say, I don't know. But what I do say is that, I think we're going to get to a point on global in Iran, we're going to have to stabilize oil and the prices of oil. And then I got called in to help Venezuela. So we helped put Venezuela paper together to try to speed up production. The president had already signed an agreement with Venezuela. The problem is it wasn't the discharge of crude. The problem was the infrastructure in Venezuela. So what we had to do is we had to hurry up speeds. We ran and generated $1 billion so we could fix the infrastructure in Venezuela. But that doesn't allow us to now still produce because we don't have the authorities under OFAC, the restrictions that come from the State Department. So we're working through that now. So in that world evaluation, we're going to try to lower the prices of oil and gas by stimulating Venezuela and stimulating some other economy to do that. So if you look at Iran, you talk about the Middle East and you're seeing things that the whole dynamic is changing. I've had about 3 tours there, 4 tours, commanded most of those units that you're seeing that are under attack. I think we're going to come to a place, everyone's asking me what's going to happen. I think we're going to take out our military objectives from the U.S. government, and I think we're going to take out the strategic objectives from the U.S. government, meaning reach those. But what I remind everyone is that the IRGC, the Islamic Republican Guard Corps, is a formidable force. It's 200,000, approximately 200,000, 180 to 200,000. That were designed specifically to protect the territory of Iran and also to preserve the political structure. So when you talk about Iran and what's the end state there, we want to stabilize. I don't know, I'm not official with the government. I just try understanding the principle and advising correctly. So what are we going to do in Iran? To me, we can take out the strategic goals, we can take out the military goals, we can reduce the ballistic threat, we can reduce the drone threat, the nuclear threat. Once we achieve those strategic objectives, we will then probably have to go back to table, in my opinion, or if the president decides, and again, I'm not speaking for him, if he decides to keep pushing on, you still have to deal with the IRGC. And that's going to create a different dynamic. So that's what's happening there. In Africa, we're trying to counter the Chinese threat, and not so much from a force on force, but use technology as a benign, benevolent form of building partnership capacity there. You've heard all the minerals, all the mines, and all that kind of stuff. What we're trying to do is make governments, and if I can bring a decision, and for example, there are a lot of bad actors that were taking gold out of Ghana. So we worked to get a gold board in, we worked to get a corporate license, we worked to get private licenses so we can control it. Now we're going to bring in a blockchain solution so we can track it, right? So, and keep it from going into bad actors. I'll try to get that to Department of Commerce, Department of Treasury, to have now a government-to-government relationship and a deal made at that level. So that's that theater as we try to get positioned in there, and we're going to try to build some ports and some other things there. So Latin South America is very important for rare earth. It's very important for the Panama Canal, and like you have out here in this theater is, how do you preserve your lines of communication and your economic lines and sea lines of communication for trade? So there's that large economic, so that's what's happening in Iran, that's what's happening in this area. How do we preserve that? How do we build up? And how do we move forward? And the Far East, we'll talk more about that and some other things, but just a kind of quick overview. There's a big question there.
Yeah, I think we're just getting started, right? I think you've mentioned almost every theatre there, right? Where something is going on and where a shock in one part of the world can have significant flow-on impacts to many other parts of the world, right? In that environment where we are seeing so much potential disruption across multiple theatres, how can organisations be thinking about resilience? Most organisations and nations will think about resilience as the ability to resist a shock and then quickly recover from that shock. So what is it that people in this room, organisations and in fact nations should be thinking about when they think about building resilience?
Well, I think resilience occurs at many different levels, right? So it occurs at the national level, the national strategic, it occurs at an operational, then it occurs at tactical. So I'll give you an example in real world. So I went up New York City. I'm based out of Washington, D.C., went to New York City. And they had, up in New York City, they had New Steel, which was the new urban science and technology lab. And when I first went up there about 3 or 4 years ago, I said, well, what are you doing to prepare for resilience? And this is one of the U.S. government under the Department of Energy, I think is where they fall. Or Homeland Security now, and they said, well, we only react to the right of the bang. And resilience, I said, what do you mean? You only, into a disaster, what are you doing to prepare for disaster? And how do you work to the left of the bang? So we're able to change that little dynamic there. I think when you talk about resilience comes from people, right? It comes from how you respond and how do you prepare, and then how do you respond to an event, whether it's good or bad, and what is your ability to bounce back. When you talk about supply chains and resilience, is how do you prevent single points of failure in a global supply chain, right? So if you're Australia, what is your supply chain and what are the single points of failure? And that's what you're seeing now with rare earth. You're seeing many single points of failure because we outsourced so much and we didn't retain organic capability. And we thought it was good to be cheap and go out here. But now you're looking at a resistance, and now you look at when you start getting to trade wars and you start talking like that, you start seeing who owns the rare earth. And if you look at it, and again, I separate, just so you know, in every discussion I give, it's like when I talk about Ukraine or Russia or China here, the people of China are different from the People's Republic of China. Right, and I always make sure that everyone knows that there's difference between the government and different people, between the people of China. So how do you now preserve resilience if China owns 80 to 85% of rare earth, and they own 80 to 85%? The numbers may change, of the ability to process, right? So if we're talking supply chain resilience, then what do we do in Australia to ensure we have supply chain resilience? And how do we have no single points of failure? And are you resilient, and do you have the ability to sustain yourself both economically, militarily, if you don't control the variables? So I'm just leaving you different thoughts that you have to do. And frankly, that's why I'm here. I'm to talk to your political leaders, I'm to talk to your universities, and to try to stimulate the economy, because I think you have a rare opportunity right now to get after rare earth, as it is number one, in Australia being either the number 2 or 3 nation in the world for rare earth. So I think if we can move quickly as a country, as I advise countries, then what we'll do is you'll posture yourself very well. If we don't move quickly, I think you'll be bypassed to some degree. It won't be absolute, but it's the importance of getting ready and preparing for that, because rare earth is very key right now on global supply chains, on resiliency, on manufacturing and production.
So interesting that you've covered there a couple of really key topics, I think, that are on the minds of lots of people here in Australia, which is supply chains. We're very far from most of our supply chain, being an island nation, and also rare earths. And I want to come back to both of those. But Omar, I might come to you for a second. And we heard from the General about all the disruptions that are happening around the world. What's your view on supply chain resilience and the role that it plays in building national resilience and defence resilience, as we've spoken about?
Right. So first, thank you for having me, and thank you, Deloitte, for hosting this event, and to my friend General John Wharton, who we've known each other for some time now, and I'm glad that he's here in Australia and we're able to do this. So supply chains, production chains, as my colleague here, Jim, mentioned earlier about the COVID, I think COVID was in the US started realizing they can't make masks. They can't make antibiotics. They're really, really dependent on China, India, and at a time of crisis, supply of antibiotics could be stopped. So that was the first time that they realized, we have a problem, or this was so that's COVID. And then I think another event that you should note is the Israeli Hamas, Hezbollah, the recent events in the Middle East. The event with the beeper operations where the Mossad intercepted the production chain of these beepers also highlighted an issue, which is production chains. So that means that every CCTV could be a bomb, could be a surveillance device. Every car could be also a surveillance device or a bomb or whatever. So countries need to have the ability to produce, or at least a country like the US, a superpower, and its allies need to be able within that network to produce everything. They don't need to produce everything, but they need to be able to do it. So that was the time when the US basically decided to double down on reshoring production chains and supply chains. So when I mean reshoring supply chains, it needs also control over the supply chains. Like batteries, for example, China controls most of the supply chain for batteries. So the US is working really hard, as the general mentioned earlier, in Africa, in Latin America, to regain control over these supply chains. And what we see in Iran, and there's a lot of, I think, maybe misunderstanding, or also what they're telling us is not the whole picture, what we see. It's at the end of the day, it's a lot of these wars, what drives them is the power struggle in, the fight to control these supply chains and production chains. And I think for the past couple of years, this is one of the themes that I've been focused on. And I think nations, as I mentioned, need to be able to produce these critical components and critical things. By the way, two things, and Steph here with Semiconductor Australia, and I think again Australia and the U.S. We have to have these the capabilities to produce these components. Otherwise, as Jim mentioned, the world, our way of life could stop.
Omar, you've touched on such an important point, right? The ability to manufacture. We often hear, you spoke about nearshoring, or we often hear the term friendshoring, working with our allies to build a resilient supply chain. What, in your opinion, are some of the policy levers that you're seeing government put in place to help drive some of that, I would say, nearshoring or friendshoring, and any thoughts that we should think about here in Australia from a policy perspective?
Right. So I'll give you an example. One of the companies I'm invested in was competing for this bid in the Port Authority in New York, where the buses are and near the Penn Station. I don't know if you're familiar with it. But one of the requirements was that the LiDAR would be produced and sourced in the U.S., including all the components within that LiDAR. So you have so critical infrastructure, for example, in the U.S. must be sourced, produced in the U.S. or allied countries. So that's a policy where it drives companies need to now look for LiDARs in the U.S. So that's just one way to implement and force companies to start sourcing these things in the U.S. and start looking for providers in the U.S. So that's just one example. But you could see how governments and how active, again, U.S. government is at helping companies onshore. And I'm involved with another company called Amera. I have two colleague board members here that came. But we saw how the government is involved with grants, loans, and so these are just two examples of how government could be helpful in influencing these.
Yeah, so there's clearly a role to play there, right, in influencing some of this decision and some of these decision makings, and so General, I just want to pick up on a point you made earlier. You're here, you're meeting with lots of organisations. Other than enjoying the beautiful view from here and visiting Sydney with some of your friends, what are some of the other purposes of your visit here while you're here out here?
Well, it is nation-to-nation agreements and trying to work some in between the politics and do things that I can do with the government. So the request from your side of the house is they're asking for, first of all, rare earth. They want to hear more about rare earth. They want to hear more about designing a world-class manufacturing capability. We want to talk, another project is a cross-continental railroad system. So, and things of that nature, and then a couple other extensions to the existing rail networks. And then there's other subjects that we're trying to tie together from a manufacturing standpoint within the world-class manufacturing center. But what I want to try to do is, again, communicate that this is a rare opportunity for Australia first. You know, Australia to take lead. The U.S. has set what they call global supply corridors or global partners, and Australia is number one on the list, right? And then you have Africa, and then you have South America, and those are dedicated supply channel partners, global partners for supply chain. So now what Omer said, and what I want to do for those of you in the business, is that, you know, the U.S. government has changed a lot of the policies and procedures to work with them. So before it was, hey, if you're not U.S. based and you're not a U.S. company, you can't do business. But you'd be surprised, and we worked the deal where, you know, we wrote the language from on the rare earth when President Albanese worked with President Trump, and they had the meeting. They committed $8 billion from the Australian side, $8 billion from the U.S. side, and part of the reason is, okay, now what's the next step? So we helped frame that argument and prepare that argument. Now what do? We've given some money to a couple companies, but how do you do it at the national level? I mean, how do you put your arms on it? And then I'm telling this to the United States too. I said, you can go ahead and do the piecemeal and give $400 million here, $300 million here to this company, get a contract here. But who's managing the strategic reserve at a higher level, at the national level? And it's not just the processing, it's the manufacturing and the refining and other steps and processes. So if I give you a company A, you know, this funding, and, you know, where's your offtake? And how do I have a dual use capability where I'm giving it both to the government for military needs or government needs and to the private sector, so that I have a business model that's sustaining. So a sustainable business model is very important. So one of my messages here is you have this rare opportunity, if we can connect all the dots. What I have seen from Australia is the fragmentation of all the systems and programs, okay? And you gotta connect the dots, you gotta collate the dots if you wanna get there. So there's some at the government, then you look at universities. UQ, I think, has a lot of subsidized from the government to know where the mines are, where the rare earth is. They're the experts. You got different funding from different parts in the north that have funds for feasibility studies and things of this nature, but they're only for the north. So how do you tie the mines with the processing, with the rare earth, with the refining and the manufacturing? Right? So you got to connect those dots. It's got to happen at a national level with assistance, right? It's not that they take over, but you got to come up with the policies that are going to fuse that so that you can make it a national program versus an individual program. And I don't mean national, meaning government oversight. I mean government cooperation as part of a public-private partnership. And in the US, we'll talk about the fourth P. And the fourth P we talk about is sometimes philanthropy. Right, so you got public-private partnerships and then philanthropy, because the governments don't have the money, right? They need private sector to help invest and help these governments to do what they're trying to do. And if we say we want to build a port here, we want to build an airfield here, well, where does that come? You got a limited, you got a budget, but that airport, that airfield wasn't in part of that plan, right? So how do you get that? How do you do that? And how do you go ahead and get that port or that airfield? So it's a public-private partnership in a team. But you have the ability, instead of getting piecemealed, all the different functions, is some way to figure out the management. And again, I'm telling that to our government, because how much do you need of a strategic reserve? You know, do you have a commodities trading platform? or a Mercantile Express. Why do Canadian companies, or why do Australian companies go to Canada to be listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange versus here, right? Because it's easier, because there's a fund that does venture capital for startups in mining out of Canada. So I'm just giving you thoughts. These are the kind of discussions we're going to have to try to help coach, and kindly, gently try to say, you got a good opportunity right now if we can capitalize on it, okay?
So to your point, a national strategic reserve should be national. It's in the name, right? It should be coordinated in a way that makes sense, and decisions can be made in a coordinated, unified way. Thank you, that makes a lot of sense. I think just following on from the rare earths conversation and all this investment that you've spoken about going into rare earths, how can organisations, particularly here in Australia, tap into not just that investment, but broader investment into the local economy and defence base based on what you're seeing around the world?
In the United States, this administration has really changed the rules. So if you think about acquisition, you think about procurement, and you think about all the things, and really commenting on what Omer said just a few minutes ago, there are tremendous opportunities now that never existed before. So at first you heard built in the United States, manufactured in the United States. That's adjusted because what is of vital interest? Rare earth is, right? It's a national security interest. So the government has changed their funding, and there are programs that can be from the US that can fund refineries and mining here if you know where to go. So they really loosened up the acquisition process and funding, whether it's a grant or a loan from Exim Bank, a grant or funding for a company to provide a refinery. So as you think about it from the business angle, you want to get educated on what programs are out there from the US government that can be brought here and help you in your business and in that cycle. At the same time, at a lower level, whereas before the Department of Defense and the Department of War now used to be just a policymaker. But what's happened is they've put a lot of money into the policymaker. They weren't executors. So now there's a lot of funding that's going up at the Department of War level for them to commit on items of national security. The Strategic Capabilities Office is one. The Industrial Base and Sustainment Program version 3 is another that have money to give to countries and to organizations that are working in national security and things of that nature. So it's a different dynamic there, an easier way to do business. I have to give this administration credit for that.
It's encouraging to hear. Omar, with your background in helping organizations with cross-border investments, any key tips and tricks on your mind that folks in the room might be able to walk away with? Anything to keep in the back of their mind as they're thinking about this topic?
Yes. Well, looking at BluGlass, and again, this is part of the playbook we've used in Amero, is DC is really important. Especially, when you say cross-border, I talk mainly about the U.S. I don't know about if you want to go somewhere else, but U.S. If you really want to succeed in the transition, formulating a coherent DC strategy is key. And it took us a long time, we spent a lot of effort in Amero, and now, Jim and I just got back from DC. We've just retained one of the most prominent government relation firm, Michael Best, headed by a former Trump Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus, and the Democrat, Steve Israel. So formulating a coherent strategy, understanding how Washington works. And, I'm fortunate to have friends such as the General John Wharton here help us navigate the various, institutions and programs and offices. It's just mind-boggling, the depth of Washington and this huge machine, which is the federal government. And by the way, after you're done with the federal government, you could go to the states, and there's still a lot, more available for you. I remember, by the way, this is just, so DC is, if I could give you one tip, it's formulating a coherent DC strategy and understanding that you need to spend time, money, effort on building these relationships and understanding how the system works. I will just say one thing, And I remember Jamie here, sitting here, when we went to Tennessee for the first time to see the Amero facility, I had told him, this facility could have been in Victoria, because Amero was started in Victoria. And I think that let's just say Victoria and Australia was just very difficult for us to build, to start a business. And
If you remember,
yeah,
it's one of our other fellow board members who's a partner at Wilson Sonsini.
that's right.
I have this high mark for the Californian government for being the most unfriendly business government in the world, but it just got picked by Victoria.
That's right. That's right. So that's right. But again, this is something I was just this could have been an Australian production facility. But in any event, moving production to the U.S., moving operations to the U.S. If I could leave you with one thing, is like build a coherent DC strategy.
Yeah, that's interesting. So there's more we can be doing to make it easy for business, by the sounds of it. You spoke about policy levers that government might think about putting in place to support building resilience and building resilient supply chains. Are there other roles that you see government playing beyond policy levers to support building local and resilient capability?
Yeah, first of all, it has to come from the government. The private sector on its own will always look for optimization and will go east or anywhere that's cheaper. So the government is key formulating these strategies. But I think I mentioned a few policies that are helpful in supporting these the transition into the onshoring. But it's also it starts with universities. It starts with developing new technologies and keeping them onshore. It starts with making sure businesses, business-friendly environment. And I think that the key advantage we have over authoritarian regimes is the business sector, is the fact that we have free entrepreneurs that are thinking and inventing, and again, supporting all this ecosystem. So, forcing the LiDAR to be manufactured in the US is one thing. But the technology and novel technologies, like, for example, that we have in BluGlass that was developed here, that attracted Jim to come and join this company. This is the type of things that make us resilient. Always keeping the technological edge, always being one step ahead, and making sure that we have this advantage.
Yeah, so it sounds like we do have good ideas in Australia. We just have to think about how to commercialize them perhaps a little bit better. So,
and keep them here.
Keep them here, right? Yeah, it's a critical part of it. So thank you. That's I think a really important tip. Having a DC strategy, keep things local. Pivoting back, General, you spoke just in your last answer about the importance of public and private partnerships. How critical are they to building resilience, and what's your view on how to build a strong public-private partnership?
Well, those are great questions. I mean, I think the thing I would do is focus on what's priorities for the country, right? So right now we know rare earths is very important, and from a processing or mineral standpoint. But what are the technologies, or what are the areas that are going to be, consistent and moving forward? So, there's a lot of artificial intelligence discussions, right? And I tell a lot of companies and countries and nations and universities that don't chase the buzzwords in Washington, right? I mean, if you think about it, we've gone from cyber to quantum to data centers to EMP to on, and everyone goes chasing those things, right? But if you establish your manufacturing base on critical items that are not going away, say it was chips or processing or something like that, and you establish the foundries, that's going to be enduring. That's not going to change due to, a time or administration or something like that. AI is not going to go away. However, everything gets self-corrected. Think about, here's AI, and then, oh, wait a minute, what's that thing called energy? I forgot about that thing, and, I got to power these things, right? And oh, by the way, what is that? What are you using that data center for? And what's the purpose, right? I mean, are we just creating data centers to go crazy because hyperscaling and all that kind of stuff? What's the purpose? And there's a different purpose for a military data center than maybe for a private sector data center, right? That Amazon or Google or somebody like that wants to have, right? So if you're in a core competency, in a core area, you're not going to fail because it's an enduring capability that's going to go. Manufacturing doesn't go away. There's a lot of talk on additive manufacturing. I've been down there, I've spoken on additive manufacturing. You know, you always got to do the cost-benefit analysis, right? You know, what is that supply chain if I'm going to do additive manufacturing? What's the cost of the supply chain to do additive manufacturing, all the parts and the distribution, all the other processes? So let's not get over enamored about additive manufacturing. You know, let's balance it with what we need. You know, a period of time, the previous administration said, hey, we're going to be 100% electric by 2035. And then here goes the Secretary of Defense at that time, we're going to be 100% electric by 2035. And then here comes me saying, no, you're not, because I can say those things publicly, right? Now, we are not going to be 100% electric in the military. You know, I can just tell you that. So I understand what we're trying to do. I got it. Okay, electrify on garrison bases in the United States, but not on tactical deployment, or auxiliary power systems that when we're sitting in an M1 and we need to look out over the horizon, we can run electrical power. So there's got to be a realistic take on everything. The balance between, say, green energy or renewable and fossil fuels, right? And what's the right balance in these kind of things? So the public-private partnership, getting back to that, is really choosing wisely of the industry, an industry that's enduring, an industry that's a critical need, or just figuring out where, if you're an investor, where are the right investments? And you guys that are investors know as well. I wish I could take that group and say, okay, here's the technology. I'll see 3 to 5 technologies every week. And I can say, yes, no, yep, no, you need to talk here, you go here. You think you're at a TRL level ready for manufacturing. No, you're not. You're at a concept development part of the phase. You guys do that naturally because you decide where you invest in. You're not going to invest in a science project, right? You're going to invest in a capability that's proven and that's got a revenue. See, so as you think through these things, you know, always put a common sense application to it. We created National Manufacturing Innovation Institutes in the United States. I had competed because of my labs and my research centers. I won 5 of the 7 that were announced across the whole of government. And that was public-private partnerships where the government would provide money, industry would provide money, and academia, they don't have much money, but they were part of that. And one was in additive manufacturing, one was in autonomous robotics, one was in flexible hybrid electronics out at California. But all of them started off in public-private partnerships, and then they started not doing so well. When I went out there to look at them, I said, well, what's going on here? Well, they didn't have a good business model, right? There was no business model. So even though it was a public-private partnership, everyone contributed, they just blew through it like a venture capital. And what happened is that they didn't know how to collect the IP. They would let companies come in, use their equipment, design something, but have no return on investment or no IP, you know, sharing of an IP. So therefore, they were out there. Well, we kind of changed that model. So one of the things in the public-private partnership, choose wisely. You do it naturally, those of you who are investors, but what are the critical areas that are needed? I can tell you for 15 years now, Austria has come to me and said, we need manufacturing for 15 years, right? Well, what are we going to do? How are we going to do it, you know? I was telling somebody about the space industry that you have here. So when I was approached to help on the space industry, I said, well, what do you want? What do you want to do? What do you want your space industry to do? You know, are you manned? Are you unmanned? Are you doing scientific? You know, what is your purpose, right? Do you want to have a military capability, that you want to have satellites in LEO, NEO, and deep space that you can now check climate? What is your purpose? So a lot of these things go to what's your purpose, what's your task and your purpose that you want to do, and what's your business model associated with that. And I see that in countries, right? I see that in a lot of countries. What we're trying to do in some countries, to give you an example, we're trying to create free trade zones. So we're going to be talking to Mexico about some free trade zone across border, and then allowing a technology corridor between countries and doing that. And we're going to work some of those down. We worked in Panama, we worked a couple others that are there to allow some of those restrictions so you can increase the trade back and forth. So those are other things we're trying to do. But choose wisely on public-private partnerships, sectors that are enduring, sectors that aren't a fad that's going to go away. Don't chase the silver bullets. The silver bullets come and go. It's what are the core capabilities that you need as a nation. Manufacturing is not going away. There may be different forms, additive, subtractive, many different things, cold spray, whatever. Just incorporate that in the right proportional relationship as you do business. So choose wisely is what I would say.
And by the sounds of it, don't forget the basics of a basic business model.
And a business model.
Right.
Yep.
You must have a sound business model for this to work. Yeah, no, that makes.
So if you have rare earth, who's the offtake? So if I'm going to either invest in a company or this, and here's this rare earth, we got this great opportunity. Do I have an ability to now coalesce? Do I have a mercantile exchange? Do I? If I'm a company and I'm going to invest in this rare earth, what often? You're going to ask them, do you have any contracts, right? What contracts do you have? Well, who's got the offtake agreements for that product or that commodity, right? And who's managing that? So, it gets pretty thin and everything starts separating very quickly when you start asking those questions. So at the national level, we want dual use capabilities. So that word dual use. We don't want to design something in science and technology that's just for one purpose. We always went into it for dual use technologies. I was fortunate to command the Army Research Lab, 23 Nobel laureates of dual use capabilities that we funded. 23 dual use capabilities that had civilian application and as well as a military application, depending on the classification, right? But it was for society. It's the Army. This was the United States Army, which was what I tell the United States is it's your Army, right? And they're doing, not everyone is carrying a rifle. There are scientists, engineers who are developing next generation capabilities, right?
General, you spoke in there about dual use capabilities. You spoke about data centers, energy grids, and there's a significant amount of civilian infrastructure that government relies on or defence relies on when it comes to national resilience and defence resilience. What's your view on how disruptions to the civilian sector or those dual use technologies could have a flow-on impact to our national resilience from a government perspective?
These are great questions there, right? I want softballs. No, I think if I understand correctly, and I think when you look at a dual-use capability or a function, the dual-use capability is part of the insurance policy for you as a company, right? It's not this, hey, there's many companies that come in and will just focus on a military application. But the dual use is the insurance policy that you have off-take in the commercial markets, right? So it shouldn't be just one dimension that you're going to go and just do military. My scientists and engineers were much like a lot of the scientists and engineers. They don't want to be doing military things. And I would say to them, well, you're not. You do science, you do technology, but I will operationalize that into a capability. You're just working science. You're working tech. Stay, do that. Be the expert in those areas. That's all I'm asking you to do, right? Because many don't want to be. Now, government ones are different than the private sectors, right? From that standpoint. So the resilience part of that public-private partnership, the dual-use technologies is your insurance for that business model. Don't count on one dimension, and don't count on the government because the government moves slower unless it's one of these critical areas, right? You got to have a backup plan that you're off-taking into the commercial markets of your products, right? And doing those kind of things.
So it's very clear that industry has a role to play and the civilian sector has a role to play in resilience. Omar, I might come to you. You've done this a few times. Organisations in the civilian sector, perhaps startups, how do they survive that valley of death when it comes to building something like this where you're trying to build resilience?
A question for the general. Well, it's a good question, and I think the government managed to, and the general gave a good example earlier today, where the Death Valley does exist if you're trying to build an F-16 or like a new jet or a tank. But if you're a manufacturer, if you're a startup that's developing a novel technology, there are a couple of programs. For example, BluGlass is a part of the ME Commons, which is a program which is considered it's called Lab to Fab. And for example, a small company like BluGlass is working with Coherent and General Electric as part of that same program. So the government actually right now, we're talking about 8 hubs, Jim? Yeah, so we have 8 hubs, which includes universities and the top companies in the U.S. And these type of programs allow startups to cross that chasm, to basically cross the valley of death and reach a point where they get a more significant order. It gives them exposure to the Coherence of the world, the Lumentums of the world, the General Electric of the world. And if they have a good, and by the way, we were able to capitalize on that. So some of our new projects that we're working on came from these relationships that were developed by Jim and the team as part of these programs. So that's just one example, but there are many of these examples, many grants, many programs, and the use of both the power of the let's say the private sector, the entrepreneurship, and then also the universities. They're all involved it's an ecosystem. And again, the U.S. it's really deep, both from sense of like capital markets, but education, government, just an ecosystem that works really well. And I think that's how I think they resolved at least part of that Death Valley. It still exists. By the way, it's also a great way to survival of the fittest. It's a screening process that some of these technologies, some of these companies fail, but it's okay.
It's part of the journey, right?
Exactly.
But rely on your ecosystem where you have it to be able to manage where you can. That's really useful advice. I think, in closing, rapid fire question to both of you, right? If there's one outdated assumption around resilience, what might that be? If you were to leave the audience with one thought about how to think about resilience differently for each of you, what might that be? General, or Omar, might go to you first. I had some softballs. We've run out of time. Sorry, General.
I think I've said it before, and we have to be able to manufacture everything onshore, period. There's no other way we don't need to make it, and hopefully the world is going to be better in the future, and we could go back to globalization, optimizing production. But unfortunately, we're not there, and we have to be able to make our own antibiotics. We have to be able to, build batteries. We can't be dependent on other governments that don't necessarily have our best interests in heart. And if we want to protect our way of life, there's no other way. And I think, again, looking at how the U.S. and the government, and you can talk about the style and how aggressive it is, but what you see is production is coming back to the U.S. Onshore, you see the industrial base that was lost is coming back to Tennessee, it's coming back to Arizona, it's coming back, and I think it's good for, it's terrible that it was lost, these capabilities, but it's not too late. And I think it's true, what I'm saying about the US is true for Australia as one of the key allies. So that's a thought I'd want to leave with you.
Yeah, just real quick, I think that's exactly right. You gotta build your own organic capabilities, and you have to figure out what you need to onshore, so there's no single points of failure. And how do you create a redundancy in your supply chains, right? And it's a mix, right? We used to be in a world where, you see how we're transitioning from dependent to interdependent. We want to get back to, the world of interdependency versus independency. And there's a trade-off between what needs to be organically done, what you need to outsource, and what are those critical capabilities that you have to retain, both as a nation but also as a company. So even if you're a company and you're producing a chip, you know, and looking at that supply chain and that ecosystem, you know, you got to figure out where you're dependent upon it. If you look at the national level, we're your second, third tier level providers, right, in a global situation, you know, and who can you count on for supplies and who can't you count on? So everything that Omar said, I'm 100% behind that. But onshoring the right balance between manufacturing, between technology, no single points of failure, understanding your ecosystem so that you can then evaluate what you're dependent upon or not. Drones were a prime example. You know, I had Ukraine come and we're helping with drones, right? Just remember, drones are just a platform. It's what you put on the platform that gives it a capability, right? But in the early parts of the war, and just to give you a little fact, in Ukraine, they have 2 minutes to decide whether they engage a drone or not. 2 minutes, right? That's all. Whether you're going to take it down either by a kinetic way, and what means. Are you going to use a missile, you know, or are you going to try to do it with a laser or something else, right? 2 minutes to make a decision. Well, what happened is, in the early parts of the war, they were receiving drones from Canada, or the engines that were being produced from the drones were in Canada, and complete single point of failure, okay, for Ukraine. So we had to go out and scrape up other drone providers and other engines, but that put them on pause for a good little bit. So no single points of failure. Look at your ecosystem, onshore what is right. How do you establish that manufacturing base here in Australia, and the right mix of what you need to have organically versus outsourcing.
Yeah, very useful guidance. Thank you for that. I think, ladies and gentlemen, clearly a lot for us to think about, right? A lot to think about our supply chain. We've got lots to think about how we play a role in the rare earth supply chain, not just for us, but beyond our borders. There's a lot here that was covered today on public-private partnerships and also the fourth P, philanthropy, and how that can play a critical role in building sovereign and defence resilience. And I think, last but not least, some really good thoughts there around it's not too late, right? It's never too late to start to build resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in thanking our fantastic panel for their insights? So I think we've got a little bit of time for some quick fire questions. We've got about 8 or so minutes left, so short, sharp questions, please, if you could. Let us know who you are and a question for the team.
Thank you. My name is John McClure. I work for a company called Scienta here. So you talk about single point of failure. 90% of all advanced semiconductors are packaged in Taiwan. If there was a scuffle in the Taiwan Strait, the global hit to GDP would be 10 to 12%, which is 10 to 12 trillion dollars. Talk about a single point of failure. All advanced chip packaging is done in Taiwan.
Yeah, oh yeah, no, we know it's a very good point, and that's why you're seeing within the United States, you're seeing a lot of initiative and funding being put in other centers. So one big center is being put in Intel in Ohio, and then you see down in Arizona in partnerships, public-private partnerships with Intel, Arizona State University, the city of Arizona, to create that single, to create alternative sources. Now, going back to, in the old days we used to say, what were our vital interests, and how did we define vital interests? Things that we would go fight or go to war with, right? So the question is, if that's the case, and you're talking about economic development, and we haven't gotten into the economics of what's going on around the world too, right? But if you close the Straits of Hormuz, that has you're cutting off 20% of the oil, right? So, hey, that's something that probably is going to get a lot of attention to, that we're either going to protect it or we're going to stay involved in that conflict. I would say that Singapore and Taiwan and those kind of countries represent the same kind of thing, a vital interest, that's key to our way of life. So I'm 100% behind you and been tracking that very, very closely. Yeah, I don't know if that answers it, but I'm just saying
Just the one point is that it's a single company that controls the technology, and despite all of the U.S. CHIPS Act, no advanced packaging can meet the capabilities of one company in Taiwan.
Yeah.
And they deliver, again, 90%
Right.
of the chips.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. I think we've got another question over here.
Well, I say, you're exactly right. I mean, and you can, and that the chips started getting attention probably about 5 years ago, right? And so now we're trying to recover all that, but that's exactly the prime example of a single point of failure, right? I mean, it's exactly to a T, right? Chips are exactly there. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Hey, Alex Shapilski from Cicada Innovations. I'm really excited I get to follow Sienta. They're one of our residents, so please, you can see the innovation firsthand if you're around for a couple of days. But thank you for really validating a lot of the reasons why we exist as a business and providing support for companies to get through the commercialization challenges. One of the things you talked about was dual use. In Australia, we have a lot of small businesses delivering a lot of great innovation, and this is one of the really big challenges for them in terms of going through this journey. When you don't have a lot of capital, you don't have a lot of resources, and you're thinking about a civilian and a military pathway to market, there are challenges and opportunities in both. Obviously, there's additional requirements and additional constraints, and that makes development journey harder. What do you see is as a successful dual-use playbook for a small business?
Well, there's a couple things that, not just in a successful dual-use playbook. What we're doing now a lot is, again, onshoring many companies to the U.S. in a partnership role. So what we tell the country is that here you have a drone company, here you have an ammunition company or whatever. Keep 100% ownership of that company, create a special purpose vehicle that we can register in the United States. And now with that partnership with a U.S. company and based in the U.S., now we can compete for U.S. government contracts, right? So that's one strategy that is happening a whole lot right now of a partnership. So the company doesn't lose any equity in what they have. 100% owned, you keep that, create a special purpose vehicle, get it registered in the U.S., and then compete for U.S. contracts. The dual use is so important from a small business and company. In the United States, what we had is we had a mentor-protege now. We found out that these big companies were then taking a small company under a mentor-protege. They'd go out and get a contract, but they wouldn't share the resources to the small company. So what we did in the government is we pay now the mentor $1 million to sponsor a company, but ensure that you adequately compensate the small business for doing that. There's a lot of talk on 8As, right, which were special set-asides for small businesses, right? If you were a service-disabled veteran, if you were a woman-owned small business, if you were, a Native American, company or a Hawaii company, partnering is a good thing, right? So don't think always of being the prime on a contract when you're a small company. Go find your partner who is in your sector, who may sponsor you, that you can go and work with. And a lot of people say, I put in a contract and we didn't get it, so-and-so got it. Well, go talk to them and have them sub to you. Many of those companies will sub to you that have 60 people that are writing contracts and that a red team of 60 people that are reviewing everything. So think of your strategy as a small business. One is maybe onshoring. One is partnering with similar or like capacities. One is bringing a public-private partnership. Industry, academia always works well as you go forward on a proposal, right? And remember, there's formal processes of here's an RFP that you can compete against, a request for proposals in the US, but there are all other things for unsolicited proposals for those disruptive technologies that we can put a white paper together and submit back through the channels on a disruptive capability that you don't know this government, but you need this, right? That kind of thing, right?
I think we've got time for maybe one more. Or we've covered all the, there's one in the back corner here. One quick short one I think we've got time for.
Hi, this is Naresh from S3B, Semiconductor Sector Service Bureau. How do you define resilience? Because that's a very broad term. If you talk about sovereign manufacturing capability, you have to import certain parts from other countries, right? You can't have everything inside the same country. So with that standpoint, I'm talking about resilience. What is defined as resilience according to you, Major? Thank you.
The last part, I didn't hear the last part. What was that?
How do you define resilience according to you? Yeah.
Well, I think they defined it in the beginning, right? But I think, again, resilience occurs at national level. So if you define it, maybe the ability to prepare, adequately prepare and respond to any crisis, any change, any disruption of your normal channel. So if you talked in terms of national resilience, say emergency, your ability to prepare, right? You know, how are you prepared? Let's use the example of Israel and the Iron Dome, right? There's a little bit of resilience at the national level to try to protect incoming missiles, right? And then there's the resilience of what happens when a round strikes and how do you respond? How do you prepare? How does your emergency management go? I think what we're talking about here in global supply chains and technological basis is really, it goes back to resilience is, can you stand on your own? Are you self-sufficient? And if you're not, and say you have a critical part like the Canadian engine, rocket engines, well, who's your second, third tier provider that you can go to do that? That would be not having a single point of failure, having resilience in your supply chain that you have another offtake or contract that you can let to do that. So a little bit touching on the edge, but that's how I would define it in a supply chain industrial base kind of way, right? Okay, thanks. Yeah. So there's one more right here.
One more?
Thanks for the final question. I'm Monica Ren from Macquarie University. So General, I would like to ask a question about as we balance the drive for industrial capability with our reliance on the global supply chain, how do we identify the threshold where independence with our allies becomes a single point of failure when we are developing the organic capability? So,
Yeah, I think I understand the question. I want to make sure I try to answer it to the best. One is what does a nation need organically to survive, right? And again, that is producing, that isn't dependent upon someone else. Here's an organic capability. So one of the things we're going to try to do is partnerships to bring in some energetics and maybe explosives to stimulate the economy and up in a region here in Australia. So what do you need as core maintenance capabilities? You know, your auto manufacturing, right? So if you have a dual use capability, here's the auto, and what else do I use those parts for? Can I also, you know, maybe there's a military offtake or a military vehicle, I don't know. But you know, what are the core capabilities you need? What do you need dependence upon from someone else, a third party provider? And you got to, it's got to boil down to economics, right? I mean, your business model and economics. Hey, this is a sustaining business model. I'm manufacturing this part, this item, this commodity, or this platform. I have a surviving business model, and I have either I own the ecosystem, and I'll give you a chips one here. So I had Qatar come to me, right? The royal family come to me and said, hey, General Wharton, tell me, look down, tell me what I need to do for Qatar. I said, you need to build a chip making factory, but not just build it. This was about 10 years ago. I said, but you need to own as much of the ecosystem as you can. Now, this is way before the talk on chips, the critical failures that we just talked about occurred. How much of the ecosystem can you own? Well, they can afford it, but Australia can't. But what do you need to have organic? And then what do you need to have that's dependent with a trusted partner that you can reach to bring into the capability? So a very good question, and I'm just trying to give you thoughts, but it's the business model, it's organic capability, what does the nation need, what stimulates the economy, provides jobs, then what do you need to outsource and use with dependable allies or businesses that you can count on, right?
So it's another way to enhance the ally shoring or friend shoring within the new ecosystem, right?
I didn't.
So that kind of organic capabilities are enforced and developed, evolved within the ally shoring and friend shoring.
Yeah, I think again, we were the rare earth and where we are now forced us to be dependent. We used to be interdependent, right? I mean, and we would share between allies, different capabilities, and they were trusted, right, and that kind of thing. So we want to get back to the interdependent. And even the thing with China, I think, is going to settle a little bit, right? We're not going to be, I think it's going to settle, it's going to self-correct. But we, again, what's organic, what do we need to have, what do we outsource, who's trusted, whether it's second, third tier logistics, who has asset visibility in the Pacific? And I think Deloitte, has a good program where they have asset visibility into the Pacific, right? That used to be a DARPA project, right, of gaining asset visibility. Tell me where my second, third level, tier level providers are, so I know where I could go in case of some disaster or needing. I hope I answered it. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, could you join me again in thanking our fantastic panel? Thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And thanks for joining us here. I think that concludes today's events. Thank you very much, everybody.